Okay, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at American culture and society after World War II. Specifically, we'll be looking at the 1950s. We'll drift back a little bit into the late 40s to give you some background information, but specifically we're looking at how the 1950s, that decade, produced social, cultural, and economic change that was so significant it shaped America for not only that decade, but for decades to come. Alright, so we're going to start with this idea of the post-war era as being one of affluence, a period where basically everyone kind of had access to everything they needed. In the post-war era, after World War II, the economy did grow very rapidly, and people did have more spending power. There was several causes for this economic growth. The first was the rise in consumer purchasing power. What that means is that people had more money to spend. This was for several different reasons. One was an overall increase in people's wages and salaries. And that'll happen for different reasons, which we'll look through at some of them here. But another reason is the availability of different forms of credit. Okay, we think of credit, we should think of it as someone allowing you to borrow money. That's what it is. We think of credit earlier in U.S. history as going to the bank and asking for a loan. Well, in the 50s, all of a sudden there's this new type of credit called the credit card. In fact, the first credit card invented was this thing called the Diners Club card. It was only able to be used at restaurants in New York City, restaurants that had agreed to accept this card. But it was the first credit card and led to the proliferation of numerous others. Another cause of the prosperity of the 50s was a new form of business called the franchise. Okay? Franchises, you know what they are. You have seen them. Franchises are nationally recognized brands. McDonald's is one of the first models of this type of business. What happens is you have a national company. What we think of every McDonald's being owned by some parent corporation, but really the individual stores are owned by different people. You pay a fee to the parent company, which allows you then to use their name, their brand, their product. Now, in exchange, you also agree to serve their food a certain way. You agree that every McDonald's is going to be red with the yellow arches. Every McDonald's is going to serve a Big Mac because the parent company wants that national name recognition, and you want it too. Because when someone is traveling from, say, out of town and they're driving by and, I'm hungry, I'm going to stop somewhere, they see a McDonald's, they know what kind of food is served there, and they're willing to stop. Another cause of the affluence of the 50s was the rise of corporations. Okay? The government is not going to interfere. Now, we are not getting back to, say, the Gilded Age and the laissez-faire attitude the government had, but the government is going to allow businesses to grow. We're in kind of a post-New Deal era. Republicans will be in charge of Congress, and so the government is going to allow businesses to grow, and those businesses are going to be able to expand. They're going to look at new products and what kind of products will people purchase. By 1960, the top 500 companies in the United States made up half of all sales recorded in the United States. And if you can think of every mom and pop store, all the small businesses that exist, and saying only 500 companies were responsible for one half of all the sales in the United States, that's a huge number. They also made up 70% of all business profits. Okay. Another reason for the affluence is the idea of mass production. Businesses are looking for new ways to create their products and looking for more efficient ways to create their products. And that's been going on. We've seen Ford and his assembly line back in the teens and 20s. But in the 50s, they start coming out with automation. The early versions of what we think of as the robotic manufacturing plants. Okay? And while on the one hand that does kind of take away from your skilled labor or might result in a loss of jobs, it actually increased the demand for people who are college educated. You're not just pushing a button to operate those robots. You have to be able to code them. So you have to have certain skill sets. You have to have more managers. You have to have, a lot of the businesses change up the way their offices are run, and you need more office workers. And so those white-collar workers are going to command a better wage. Another cause of the growth of the 50s, something we can't ignore, is this thing called the GI Bill of Rights. Also known as the GI Bill, officially it was called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. At the end of World War II, as we approached the end of World War II, someone conducted a poll of American society and said, "What are you afraid of here at the middle of 1945?" The number one answer was a return to the Great Depression. People in America realized that it was World War II that had pulled us out of the Great Depression. And they were afraid that once the war was over and war production stopped and all these millions of soldiers came back home, we were going to sink back into it. So the GI Bill of Rights was meant to keep the economy going. Right? What it did is it took these returning soldiers and offered them basically three opportunities. The first one was low-interest business loans. If you want to start your own business, the government would give you a low-interest loan so you could start your own business. It would offer low-interest home loans. If you wanted to build a home, if you wanted to buy a home, the government would give these veterans a lower interest rate. That way they could afford to buy a new home or maybe a better home. And what it's really known for is the idea of they're going to give soldiers money to go back to school to obtain degrees, whether it's a technical college degree or a 4-year degree or something beyond even that. Okay? These three things, while they all sound wonderful and benefits that our veterans deserve, here's how they affect the economy and keep us from going back into the Depression. These business loans. All right, we have soldiers coming back who are going to need jobs. Let's let them create their own. And if their business is somewhat successful and they need more employees, not only are they creating a business, they're creating available jobs for the other returning soldiers. Okay? The home loans. Okay? If more veterans can afford to buy homes, more people will buy homes. There's probably going to be new home construction. This will result in new and more home construction jobs. And finally, these funds to pay for college serve two purposes. Number one, you take veterans out of the labor force. If they don't have to pay for college, if the government will do it, they can go to school and not have to have a full-time job, which keeps them out of the labor force for at least a time. Then, when they come out of college, they have a degree which allows them to get a better job or a new type of job or start their own business. So this is a huge part of the economy. Another cause of the good economy of the 50s is the automobile industry. Okay? The automobile industry in the 50s, it is energized because the car becomes basically the symbol of success. How do you know you've made it? You can afford a car. And it becomes one of the things everybody has to have. What do you mean you don't have a car? Why do you not have a car? Everybody has to have a car. The more cars there are, the more roads we need, and the more roads we demand our government provide for us. Okay? You're still in an era where a lot of the roads, especially out in the countryside, were dirt. And so people are going to demand paved roads. And so by the time you get to the end of the 1950s, somewhere between 70 and 80,000 miles of new roads are being paved every year. Okay? These can be new gravel road construction. This can be just asphalt overlays. But it was a huge thing. And with more roads, you have that then feeds back into the, well, I can buy a car now because there are roads, there are places for me to travel. Now, in 1956, the national government is going to pass a law called the Federal Highway Act. Sometimes it is called the Eisenhower Transportation Act because President Eisenhower put his full weight and authority behind the idea of passing this. But what it did is it authorized $26 billion to begin construction of the interstate highway system. Okay? The interstate highways that we all drive on, I-45 in Texas, I-5 out in California. These highways were all built with federal money. And so that becomes not only a result of the growth of the automobile industry, but it also then again causes growth in the automobile industry. Because it's okay to buy a car because you can drive on the highways now. And you can go longer distances. In the 50s, we also talk about the rise of the suburbs and the rise of suburbia. Okay, if you remember, think back in the census of 1920, we talked about how there were more than 50% of Americans lived in the cities. Well, as we go into the late 40s and the 50s, people begin draining out of the cities into the suburbs, moving into the towns outside of the cities, for many different reasons. Okay, a lot of them being they wanted to leave the crowded cities, they wanted to leave the polluted cities, they wanted to move out further where they could have a bigger yard or a newer house. Okay? And so people are wanting to move. That demand is going to be satisfied by the growth of things called Levitt towns. Levitt towns are named for the Levitt brothers who kind of pioneered this industry. And what Levitt towns were entire neighborhoods being made up of what we call cookie cutter houses. A company would come into an area, they would kind of clear off a huge area of land, take, say, 10 or so blueprints for houses. Lot number one is blueprint number one. Lot number two is blueprint number two, and so on and so on and so on. Okay? And so you had the cookie cutter houses. And what they were able to do is, as they went through this neighborhood, they were able to hire different crews that would work the different parts of the home construction. And so, one of the first things you have to do is you have to lay the foundation. So let's say we have a concrete foundation. So I'm going to have my crew that does the concrete foundation, the concrete slab, come in, and they're going to work on house number 1 today. Tomorrow they will be on house number 2. The next day they'll be on house number 3. Well, then my framing crew is going to come in, and while my concrete crew is, pouring the foundation for, say, house number 4, my framing crew is starting to put up the studs in the walls for house number 1. And it's, if you can think of an assembly line, except instead of the pieces coming to the workers going to the finished product. And that's another form of mass production, and that helps lower the cost of production, which then helps lower the final cost of that home, making it more affordable. Add to that the GI Bill that will give you a low-interest loan. Demand for housing in the suburbs increases. Also, the highways, the interstate highways, as those are going to be built, people start realizing that you can still work in the city, but you can live further away, because in order to get to work, you just jump on the highway, drive into work. It's a 15, maybe 20-minute drive, and you're there. The idea of the suburban lifestyle is also idealized on television. Television is going to be invented in the 50s. And television in the 50s portrayed life in the suburbs and life in America as kind of this perfect place. One of the early and most popular shows of the 50s is something called Leave It to Beaver. Okay? This is the family here. This is the Cleavers. Okay, Ward Cleaver, June Cleaver. This is the Beav. This is Wally, his older brother. And they showed society just as perfect. And they lived in the suburbs, and they had 2 cars, and no problem was something that couldn't be overcome in 30 minutes. But it showed the ideal family and society in the suburbs, And because that's what people are showing you, this is what you need to live up to, that's what people started trying to get. Okay? That idealized television society, this idea of moving to the suburbs, also increased this thing we've talked about before called consumerism. You have to buy things. In fact, in the 50s, they come up with a term, are you keeping up with the Joneses? Who are the Joneses? The Joneses are your neighbors. Are you keeping up with them? They bought a new television. Did you buy a new television? They have a new car. Do you have a new car? You have to do things to keep up with them. And so there was this idea of we can spend more and make ourselves more happy. The suburbs, ultimately, in the 50s, are going to become the American dream. Okay? The 50s sometimes are referred to as the decade when we realized the American dream. Every family has a house. Every family has 2 cars. Every family has 2 kids and a dog. The kids do well in school. And so financially, we talk about the 50s being that realization of the American dream because there's this perception that everybody had so much stuff. If you can look in the background image over here, okay, where you have the moving vans, all the moving vans showing up in a Levittown, in a neighborhood, all on the same day. Okay. It was just crazy, the consumerism that existed in the 50s. Now, the 50s are also a time for youth culture. And in our popular imagination, we drift back to this and we say, oh, yes, we know the youth culture. Youth culture in the 50s, what it is, it's the fact that teenagers kind of had their own culture. Suddenly, this was new in America. Young people had always had a kind of a culture, but it was young people in their 20s, young people who were professional and semi-professional and whatever else. This all of a sudden was teenagers. It has to do with something called the baby boom and the baby boom generation. The baby boom generation are all the kids that were born between 1945 and 1960. There were 65 million children born during those years. So it was a tremendous spike in childbirth. And there are several reasons why. The biggest one is people had been putting off having kids. You have the Great Depression that starts in 1929. It extends through the 30s. And then in the early 40s, you have World War II. And so during the Great Depression, people put off having kids because they just couldn't afford it. Then during World War II, the men are shipped off. They're in Europe. Well, then when they come back, you have a lot of people who say, hey, if we're going to have kids, we need to do it now. We can afford to have kids now. And so all those people that had put off having kids started trying to have kids, plus the ones that are naturally going to be of age to have children anyway. And you have this huge change in population demographics. That change in population is going to cause, either directly or indirectly, economic changes. Okay. See, with 65 million kids being born during that time, it's going to change the way local governments spend their money. Because all of a sudden you have way more kids, you need things that kids are going to use and kids are going to need and government is going to pay for. That's going to be stuff like new schools. In addition, families are going to want activities for their children, so the government may have to there may be pressure put on the government to start building new city parks. And so governments are going to have to shift their spending into areas where these are things kids need. And that would be an indirect result. Now, in the 50s, these kids are also going to get their own purchasing power. They are the first really teenage generation in the United States to be economic decision makers. Whether it is them getting jobs, the idea of the kid with the paper route. He gets a couple bucks a day to throw papers in his neighbor's yard. Or if it's the idea of a parent, a kid coming to a parent saying, Dad, there's this thing I want to buy. Can I have a couple of dollars to do it? And the parent thinking back, I grew up during the Great Depression and I didn't have anything. I want more for you and I have some money in my pocket. Here you go. Because this is what my father couldn't do for me. Let me do it for you. But those kids had purchasing power. So they had money. So these new corporations are going to figure that out and they're going to start marketing directly to the kids. Whether it is, look, this is something you want, this is something you need, you have money, go buy it, or the idea of, here, this is something you need, go tell mom and dad they need to buy it for you. And so teenagers are going to start buying things. There's a movie star in the 50s, a guy named James Dean. James Dean stars in a movie, and he wears this red windbreaker. And it's kind of this iconic symbol of the 50s. And all of a sudden, when this movie came out, the sale of red windbreakers just went through the roof. Because everybody wanted to be just like James Dean because he was so cool. Now, this baby boom generation, all these kids being born, and all this stuff being marketed to them also leads to what we call a generation gap. A generation gap is the disconnect that exists between children and their parents and their different beliefs and different values and their different worldviews. Okay? Because these kids in the 50s are going to see certain things and say, these things are cool, this is what we want to do, we want to ride a motorcycle. The idea of the kid riding the motorcycle with a leather jacket, and you make up a gang name for your bike gang. Oh, that's so cool. Whereas the parents are going to say, no, that's, you're being a hoodlum. You should be conforming. You should be doing well in school. TV says you should be doing well in school. Why aren't you doing well in school? Why are you smoking cigarettes and whatever else? And so there's this generation gap that exists, again, really for the first time in U.S. history, and nothing symbolizes that generation gap more than rock and roll. Okay, one of the things in the 50s, the rock and roll music, some of the great rock and roll artists, this is Chuck Berry. Get Your Kicks on Route 66. Johnny Be Good. These rock and roll songs that you probably know because you've heard them in movies where we use them today for kids' movies and stuff. This is Buddy Holly. Buddy Holly was very popular, especially among the younger people. In the late 1950s, he was killed in a plane crash. He and maybe you've heard of Richie Valens, who sang La Bamba. They were killed in this plane crash. And for hundreds of thousands of teenagers around the country, this is devastating news. The idea that someone that they looked up to and somebody that they idolized all of a sudden died, and died extremely young in tragic circumstances. It was emotionally devastating. And then, of course, you have the King, Elvis, who everyone loved. Elvis, you know his nickname. Elvis is the King, but he was also nicknamed Elvis the Pelvis because when he was on stage and performing, he would shake his hips a lot. When he went on TV on something called the Ed Sullivan Show, Ed Sullivan was kind of the older generation, and when he saw Elvis practicing and shaking his hips, Ed Sullivan ordered his cameraman to film him only from the waist up when he went live, because we weren't going to show that kind of stuff on television. Now, all this is fine and good and wonderful, and that's in our collective memory, and we think back on these things. But in the 50s, there are also criticisms of that very thing that we idealize. Okay? And people criticize it now, and it's fair to look back on things and criticize it, but people in the 50s criticized it too. And that's what I'm talking about here. Okay? One of the groups of people who criticized what they saw in the 50s was a group called the Beats. Okay? The Beat Movement. Or maybe you've heard them referred to as the Beatniks. Okay? Down here on the right, these are the stereotypical Beatniks here. The guy in the black turtleneck, black pants, black beret, reading bad poetry and beating on the bongos. Right? But if you look at these guys over here, these are guys who were part of the Beat generation as well, and they look just like anybody else in the 50s would dress. What the Beats were is they were people who were challenging that idea of conformity. Okay? In the 50s, society says, look, you go to high school, you go to college, you get a job, you get married, you move to the suburbs. The Beats are sitting there saying, well, what if I don't want to go to college? What if high school is not for me? What if I want to drop out? Don't drop out. Okay? But what if I don't want to go to college? What if I want to write? What if I want to be a writer? Okay? This guy Jack Kerouac, he was one of those guys. What if I want to be a writer? What if I want to just travel around the world, have experiences, and then write? Okay? Jack Kerouac is one of the people that is looked to by these folks in the beat movement as kind of their leader. He wrote a book called On the Road, which a lot of them kind of adopted as the Beats Bible. But it just cataloged his experiences around the country, where he talked about, this is the culture where they're going to start, using the recreational drugs. This is a culture where, okay, society says I have to get married. What if I don't want to get married to her? What if we just want to live together? Why do we have to get married? Why do we need the piece of paper? What if I'm not in love with her in 6 months? Okay. And so the Beats challenged that idea of conformity. There were also people who challenged the discrimination and segregation that continued to exist. African Americans fought in World War II hoping that at the end of the war, the government was going to say, you know what, because you fought for rights you're not given, we are going to give those to you. And instead they came back to discrimination and segregation. Now, we're going to deal with this in a later unit. So that's all I'm going to say about it right now. But understand, this was a criticism of the 50s. Another criticism of life in the 50s is the fact that even though we have that idealized version of what society looked like in the 50s with the economic affluence, there's still a lot of poverty in the United States. 20% of people in the United States lived below the poverty line. The poverty line is this number that the government says, if you're making less than this, you really can't afford to live. And 20% of the people in the 50s lived below that line. And so there was this criticism of, well, how can we have all this affluence? How can we have people moving into these suburbs over here, and, buying new cars and everybody having 2 cars when we have all these people living in poverty? This guy, Michael Harrington, writes a book called The Other America, where he describes the poverty that exists in America. He goes to rural areas and he goes to urban areas, looking at the different forms of poverty, and not only the poverty, but also the discrimination that is leading to some of the poverty. In the 50s, we also see as one of the criticisms of what is going on in the inner cities. Now, nowadays, you refer to the inner cities, people, there's kind of a derogatory term. This is the inner city. This is the bad neighborhoods. Here, when I use the term inner city, I need you to understand I'm talking about the central part of the city, kind of the downtown regions of the major cities, say New York, Detroit, Dallas, Los Angeles, those places. That's what I mean by inner city. Okay, that core area. Okay? What happens is, in those core areas during the 20s, 30s, 40s, you had a lot of businesses there. You had apartments. You had people living there. Well, now that we have this idea of you have to move to the suburbs, people that can afford to, the middle class people that lived kind of in that central city area, started moving out and started moving to the suburbs. And while highways allow them to come back into the city to shop, all of a sudden it is not something they're going to do every day. All of a sudden it becomes something they will do on the weekends or every other weekend or once a month. And as businesses started seeing less foot traffic from that demographic, the businesses made the decisions to move their locations from the cities out to the suburbs. So from the central cities, you're losing your people you're losing the wealthy, you're losing the middle class, now you're losing the business, and what are you left with? You're left with empty storefronts and apartment rents that are going down because not as many people want to live there. And so you end up with what is called urban decay. Buildings and storefronts and areas of the cities where there's no one there to bother to take care of these. These are privately owned buildings. The government is not responsible for upkeep on these until all of a sudden a tenant, say, abandons the building and it becomes some kind of hazard, and now all of a sudden the government has to condemn it, and the government has to take it, and now what is the government going to do with an empty storefront? They don't know. And so you had urban decay. And so a lot of the major cities suffered from this idea of urban decay. What they will eventually come up with in the late 50s and extending into today is something called urban renewal. With urban renewal, the cities are going to find businesses and they are going to come to some kind of agreement where these empty storefronts, these empty buildings will be bulldozed or renovated or replaced with something higher end to try to attract people back to the cities. There is evidence that that does work. There are several cities where they have gone into rundown neighborhoods. The city has wanted to, say, destroy, old apartments that are run down, that aren't being used anymore, and replace them with higher end apartments and shops and whatever. This is different from something called gentrification. Gentrification is where people start moving into the neighborhood and changing things. We'll talk about that later. But urban renewal is a concerted effort to change the housing, to make it more high-end and market it as more high-end. The problem with urban renewal is ultimately, if you look at how many housing units were destroyed, not as many housing units were replaced. So imagine bulldozing, 4 cheap small apartments and replacing them with 1 large apartment. It's 1 apartment, not 4. So you have 3 family units who are displaced. And so that's a criticism of urban renewal. Alright, that's all for this slideshow. I hope that that gave you an idea of what the 50s were like, even though it was kind of quick. I hope it gave you some background information. I also hope that by the end you understand that it wasn't all roses. It wasn't all what we picture in our collective American consciousness of it being such a great time. Thanks for watching.